I'm Alan WIERDAK. Um, okay. Basically, our project kind of took a pretty experimental approach, kind of connecting to the last presentation, where what we really wanted to do was do the cleaning and transforming of the data from the Charlotte City directory, and connect it with other archival sources, specifically historical newspapers. Most of them were found using the ProQuest historical newspapers database. So a lot of this you have already seen before. I feel like this image is already overkill after the end of the fourth presentation. One of the main goals of computational thinking is to kind of explore computational treatment of archival and cultural content. And so I feel like this project utilizes several different data practices, creating data, which I feel like is kind of a question mark, because if you're cleaning and transforming something that already exists, how are you creating data? So I think the way that we were looking at it was we were trying to create useful data, using clusters, which Anna will talk about, basically to create useful data that we could connect to other archival sources. And then, of course, manipulating data, analyzing it. I feel like those are a bit more obvious. Modeling and simulation practices, just, trying to, I feel like, what we were really trying to do was bring a phone book back to life in different ways using other sources. So I feel like that's kind of how we were using different computational models to understand, the concept, and just, using different approaches to this, problem of having, the data set from a phone book from a city directory from 1911. What are the different ways that you can look at it, that you can connect it? And then just, investigating a lot of these complex systems, in their entirety, understanding the relationships between these systems, and also just, drawing connections between collections, and just, thinking in different levels. You've also seen a lot of these images already before. So I don't know. I mean, I just did kind of a deeper reading of the main page of the directory, and just, finding out that it was, compiled by Ernest Hutchison Miller, who was actually an Asheville resident, who served as the secretary treasurer for the Knoxville Directory Company and the secretary general manager of the Piedmont Directory Company. And this was published and issued by the Piedmont Directory Company. And this series actually succeeded another series of the Charlotte Directory, which had been issued annually on June 1st. So just to put it into a little bit of context. And then what I actually found from searching for the Piedmont Directory, as other groups have already established, there are different years of the Charlotte City Directory in Internet Archive, but there's also all of these Piedmont directories for different cities and in different states, really throughout the South. So I think what we were trying to do, one of our goals is to connect, to basically show what's possible with all these different directories. I mean, I feel like as another Hills student, just trying to connect this, more historically, thinking about, directories as part of, the growth and statistics of the progressive period. So, from a quick search in WorldCat, we were able to find all these different, Piedmont directories that were, most of them are in the HathiTrust. And HathiTrust, I feel, is not necessarily the most accessible, but still it provides access. So, we basically use different keyword searches, and using OpenRefine to kind of clean and transform everything. So I will go to the next slide.
Hi, I'm Anna. Yeah, no, I was the one mostly messing with our OpenRefine data sheet, which, by the way, it's really easy to use OpenRefine, actually. Even if you don't really know code, they have this little cheat sheet that you can kind of see on the screen here. It goes like really, really far down. It's incredibly helpful. even with no coding background. So, and then if you scroll down more, you'll see that like you can use any kind of file essentially. It's like Excel, JSON, XML. There's a whole lot of different options that you can take it. And then once the file loads, it looks like this monstrosity. It's a lot of rows that we had to work with. So it was really interesting. Yeah, like 15, over 15,000, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, what was really funny is, we kind of started with this big goal and big ambition of connecting the data to historical newspaper articles, most of them from 1911. But when we first started doing it, we were like, nothing was really coming through because we were only using, 3 or 4 pages from the directory. So, really thanks to the tireless efforts of Dr. Marciano for putting together what we refer to as thick data. For changing, because you'll see this is the original data set where it's just 133 rows. So there's only so much that you can connect with historical newspapers articles using only 133 rows. Thick data, however, is 15,711 rows, which the possibilities are truly endless. So Anna, I'll let you talk about that a little bit more.
Okay, yeah. Oh man, so there were, like Ellen was saying, there's just so many different options of ways you can take this. And since we wanted to do a more of a historical take, we looked at the companies mostly first. If you scroll down, I believe.
Oh, sure.
It's okay. Yeah, so you can go over to like a text facet, and then you'll be able to cluster it, and then you'll get stuff like that where it says the cluster and edit company. And then from there, you'll see how these clusters are basically just it's OpenRefine finding very similar words in the data set, and it thinks that they are the same thing, just trying to be different. And we had a handful of those kinds of errors. Like for this one, it's the ampersand sign and some spacing issues. For another one that's down there, it was, I believe, the apostrophe. Yeah. And yeah, the apostrophe there doesn't really need to be there or whatever. It's very strange how it transfers over sometimes. And then just capitalization errors there. And then sometimes the words are completely flipped around. But once you go ahead and merge those clusters, you get no more. Oh yeah, so here is when I went through the company details because I was interested to see how that went. And there are similar errors again, but throughout all these companies, I found that they were all listed as white, which I thought was interesting to even list a company as a race in the first place, but I'm sure it's like referring to ownership, which just goes to show the disparities there between white and black people in 1911 Charlotte. And then the widows category was really weird to me because you see how they're very, very similar here. And I was like, oh, maybe they are different people, or like, I don't know why I was like, maybe they're Mormon in 1911 Charlotte, North Carolina. Obviously, I was wrong. If you scroll down, you can see that they were totally different people. They didn't live anywhere like with each other, like different names completely. So it was just a weird instance of similar names. It was crazy.
And then, so here's where we really tried to connect a lot of these patterns into the historical newspapers articles. So, what I did first when we set out, just, in the ProQuest historical newspapers database, here are my search terms, Charlotte and Carolina. And then I, limited it from, January 1st to December 31st, 1911. And we got, over 800 results. Not, most of them were not really useful. Most of them did not connect to the directory, but there were an abundance of them that did. And Maureen's actually going to talk about that.
Yeah, so my role in the group was kind of, fleshing out the narrative. We did, myself and Alan kind of divided the work of searching. Alan looked at kind of Charlotte's on a national scale and where it played into kind of large overarching narratives that were happening historically at the time. And I looked more specifically at some of the addresses. I specifically honed in on addresses from the original data set that was just the kind of the limited one. And then once we got the data set that was generated from the entirety of the directory through Dr. Marciano's tireless work, we were able to kind of expand that. So I kind of honed in on a couple of themes that were recurring, looking at these kind of arrays of articles. So I think that they tell a really good story about what was happening in the US as well as in the South specifically. One thing that emerged from the articles that were kind of picked out by Alan and myself were the economic growing pains at the time. So there was a lot of upheaval during this era. It was post-Reconstruction, but still when the South was trying to kind of get its footing as its role in the economy was developing. So one thing that was kind of an indicative part of that was the Industrial Revolution and the growth of industry. So there were a lot of big railway projects that both connected Charlotte to the world as well as to its various industries and allowed for a lot of new transit to happen. So that's what kind of is here with this one. They made a nice big new railway system. And interestingly enough, JB and BN Duke, who were the founders, were involved with both the American Tobacco Company and there was one other industry that they were involved in. If you would scroll down a little bit. Yes, the Southern Power Company, exactly. So they were very big industry barons. So it kind of shows the development of kind of a new brand of capitalism that was kind of unfolding in the 20th century. And then, of course, there was not without struggles. So we had some issues where there was a water famine in Charlotte that was kind of, according to the people of Charlotte, caused by government corruption and kind of inefficiency at the era. Perhaps they were unequipped to deal with this new boon of technology and economic development that they were facing. There was also a lot of union efforts and workers' organization that was kind of typical for the time that was happening across the country. This article in particular pointed out a railway telegraphers union that they were trying to develop, and in the efforts of lobbying for an 8-hour workday and higher wages, which again folds into the kind of railway development. And then we also have the prevalence of kind of a rental economy. So there were a lot of people renting. It was kind of the era of everybody owning their own home had fairly passed at this time. So a lot of the working force was renting. And we had a lot of recurring addresses in the directory that once cross-examined with the newspapers showed to be boarding houses or homes that frequently rented out to boarders. And then we also had prohibition. So this began a lot earlier in some places in the South due to the temperance movement than federally. So but before they were implemented federally, South Carolina had a lot of prohibition guidelines. So there was a lot of limited alcohol sales. I think it was restricted only to the state. So they had to kind of have state-sponsored stores for selling alcohol. They also still did socialize regularly. There was a lot of newspaper coverage of various social events that were happening in the city, despite the lack of alcohol. But there were also a lot of large members-only clubs that catered to the social elite that ended up kind of having to weasel their way around some of these restrictions. And once they got caught, they would be hit with some hefty fines. So places like the Colonial Club, which was a members-only club that hosted both local up-and-coming society members as well as conventions and meetings, they were hit with a pretty hefty fine for trying to skirt around the prohibition laws at the time. And then, of course, as with the rest of the South, there was a lot of post-Confederate legacy in South Carolina that could be cross-referenced with the directories. So there was a lot of changes in the economy that led to the bankruptcy of cotton brokers and some other people that were involved in the very, very definitively pre-Confederate in agricultural economy that of course is still very present in the South, but like it was getting more towards industry at this time. So it shows a lot of shifts in the economy. And there was also the development of a lot of Black industry and Black communities. There were quite a few different academic institutions and religious institutions developing at the time to cater to the newly freed Black communities as they were kind of stepping out into the world. And one of those was the Tuskegee Institute that was able to allow for religious and academic discussion amongst the Black community. And then we did also just have a kind of a lot of other really interesting articles here that didn't really quite fit into the narrative, but were very interesting. And we did also have the Monument Project, which was a post-Confederate monument that was sponsored by the Daughters of the Confederation for putting up a Confederate monument in South Carolina and Charlotte. So that was, again, kind of the ghosts of the past of Confederacy, and that continued to exist in South Carolina at the time.
Yeah, just to supplement onto that, I think, what we found in a lot of these articles were direct references to names that we could then identify in the directory, and you could kind of put, an address and an occupation and a bit more information to what we were finding in what is generally, national newspaper coverage, because in the ProQuest Historical Newspapers database, there's no local newspaper for Charlotte or for North Carolina even. I think the closest newspaper is the Atlanta Constitution, which we did find some articles in. But, say for this last one, this article was really interesting because, in addition, to the United Daughters of the Confederacy in North Carolina, they adopted these 2 resolutions. And, one is, they're trying to raise $50,000 for, a monument to the Confederate dead of North Carolina in Gettysburg. And then another one that is basically protesting what they would consider to be, liberal education. So when I saw that, I thought about the current controversies about Confederate monuments, coming down. And then I also thought about, the rhetoric and discourse around the 1619 Project and how you have all these, Confederate senators coming out and saying all this, completely ignorant nonsense about the 1619 Project, like they never even read it. And it's just interesting to see these articles, popping up in the historical newspapers database. But what I wanted to show is there's this, Miss Gordon Finger of Charlotte cast the only dissenting vote against the resolution to basically protest against what they considered to be Northern historical education. And what we were able to find from there was that, Mrs. Gordon Finger, according to the directory, her first name is Maud. Her husband owned the Finger Hardware Company. And, we have addresses for everything. She lived in a house with her husband at 403 West 8th Street. And, Finger Hardware was at 28 North College, which currently seemed like it was right in the heart of Center City, Charlotte, which I think is also a comment on, urban renewal and, past and present and things like that. So in our last slide, Anna, did you want to talk about the...
Yeah, no, on this one, I just sort of wrapped up exactly like where our computational thinking came from. So it's kind of going to be a summary of what Alan said earlier, but in terms of the data practices, like creating data, we figured we are creating useful data. So we went ahead and said, yeah, no, we did create data. And manipulating the data is basically entirely what OpenRefine does. It from transforming to just different facets and clusters that you can just manipulate that with. It's pretty impressive. And then with analyzing that data, you could just see a lot of different connections. It's a little tricky to see at first, but once you like start looking a little deeper, it's like, oh my God, wow. And then for the computational models to understand a concept, just through manipulating this data set, we were able to see the disparities of race in Charlotte. It was really interesting to look at, and the articles that we discovered definitely helped us flesh that out a little. And then assessing the different approaches or solutions to a problem. Just when we first started looking at this, we were like, how are we even going to tell a story? But then once we really cut it down into the clusters, it made it a lot easier. And plus we also just ran into like dumb little coding issues just trying to put the notebook together. But we did manage to fix that, obviously. And then our stories page completely covers the investigation of complex systems, like just completely covers that. And then the understanding relationships is just how we were able to isolate the data using OpenRefine's cluster feature as well as the text facet feature. And then from those isolations, we were able to see all these little connections between the two. And then thinking in levels, it's basically breaking it down so it's like, okay, we're not really looking at all 15,000 rows. We're looking at these specific things in these rows. And that made it a lot easier to just compute in our heads, essentially. And then for more that you could possibly do with this is that the Piedmont directory was used in a lot of different states and cities, as Alan had said before. So in theory, you could either build off of what we have here by going into things that we didn't do or that we did do but didn't go deep enough, or go to a completely different state if you wanted.
Totally. Like the possibilities really are endless. We felt like, and actually there was the one thing I wanted to end on with showing everyone was this one little article right here from 1930, where a local cop in Asheville was suing the Piedmont Directory Company for a total of $25,000, 12.5 of it punitive, and 12.5 compensatory. Jesus, I can't say that word. Sorry. But we found this really funny because his name appears with an asterisk, which was the symbol that basically would say that he was, African American. But as it says in the third word of the article, the cop was white. And, that was a huge element of cleaning and transforming the data for us was, the asterisks. So I thought that was a really fascinating connection. So that's kind of what we wanted to conclude with, was to show this and then just, kind of be like, it's not necessarily just looking at the directory in terms of the names and the addresses, but also just the Piedmont Directory Company itself and the connections that you can make between a phone book and so many other elements of U.S. history, to me, were really fascinating. So I guess we'll stop there, and I'll stop my share now. So thanks, y'all. Sorry about that.
Sorry.
I'm gonna say it was mind-blowing, that finding. And I mean, that's like a research paper right there. Just because when you get like OpenRefine and sometimes you see asterisk, you think that's an error. You don't think that that was an important element in the analysis. So now you know that you cannot remove it, because then you're losing the contextual data about race. So besides that thing, so wow, that's pretty awesome. Archival analysis, analyzing newspaper. I mean, you guys took it to the next level.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you.